Hello, ladies and gentlemen, to this lecture on the effects of the Industrial Revolution. We saw the causes in Great Britain, and basically every nation kind of follows that blueprint. The effects will be different based on the country and when they become industrialized. But remember, the causes were the factors of production all coming together at a perfect time. We have land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and the X Factor, all coming together to allow for Britain to be the first. The United States will soon follow, France, other European nations, and then slowly it will spread throughout the world, but very slowly. This is why much of the early part of this class is so Eurocentric. Okay, and today we're going to focus on the effects. With that, we get this idea of urbanization. And urbanization is the movement of people from farms to cities. This is probably the biggest. Before Industrial Revolution, most people in most countries were agrarian, meaning they lived in the farmland. They produced enough just for themselves. But with factories being very condensed or developed in clusters due to the resources, say close to a river or a bay for transportation, or where the coal was, it made people go to those areas. If you think about the United States, Pittsburgh, big coal. Okay, you see on the coast, New York, Boston, these areas where transportation, New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi. You get things like that where people are going to come together. Or San Jose. Okay, with technology, it's kind of the same thing. People are going to clump together based on business. And so this is probably one of the greatest effects. From there, we get what happened. So with all these people moving into the city so quickly, there was no infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, there was no electricity, there was no sewage, there was no running water. People threw their, poop in a bucket, throw it out on the street. Okay, a horse is dead on the street. No garbage disposal. There was a lack of education and police protection. And really, there was no government regulations as we see them. There weren't any housing codes or anything like this. We get these big apartment buildings, basically tenements or what we would call the projects now. And so people are packed. With that, you get a lot of medical issues. You get epidemics were common. Cholera would go throughout. Bad water, people drink bad water all the time, and so that was something. So the average life in Great Britain in 1842, living there was 17. If you lived out of the cities at that time, it was 32. That's a dramatic difference. And here's just a quick quote from a primary source. Frequently, the inspectors found two or more families crowded into one small house, and often one family lived in a damp cellar where 12 or 16 persons were crowded. Children are ill-fed, dirty, ill-clothed, exposed to cold and neglect, and in consequence, more than one half of the offspring die before they have completed their 5th year. The strongest survive, but the same cause which destroyed the weakest impair the vigor of the more robust. And hence, the children of our manufacturing population are proverbially pale and sallow. Now, we get these working conditions. What were they like? That was nonstop. There are very few regulations or safety codes, no government protections. Remember, government wants to support business. And so how we see this going is that government will support business. There'll be deregulations. And then once workers and enough workers start complaining, we get the idea of unions coming in. But once we get enough workers complaining, things will slowly change and the government might take notice and do things about them. But early on in the Industrial Revolution, people are working nonstop, an average of 14 hours a day, 6 days a week working. This included women and children, okay, at a very young age. Nonstop work, day after day, week after week, year after year. Not very much education. This is another quote from a primary source. I have known more accidents at the beginning of the day than at the later part. I was an eyewitness of one. A child was working wool, that is, to prepare the wool for the machine. But the strap caught him, and he was hardly awake, and it carried him into the machinery. And we found one limb in one place, one in another, and he was cut to bits. His whole body went in and was mangled. Okay, these accidents would happen quite often. Bad news is there's no government protection, there's no government help at this time, and so really those factory owners ran the place as they wanted, and it was all about making money. Now, because of this, there were some good things that happened, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, we're talking about environmental conditions, okay? And then we get no regulations at this time either. So the coal blackened the air, textiles and other waste poisoned the water. This is a political cartoon from looks like 1838. Father Thames introducing his offspring to the fair city of London. Okay, kind of Father Thames is the Thames River, and this is the children who drank out of it, and this is the river that goes through. You can see the industry in the back. There are very few government regulations, so the environmental conditions are horrible because of it. Now, let's talk about the class tensions. Because of this, we get a huge gap between the rich and the poor, a huge gap. But at the same time, we get this emerging middle class where we'll get an upper middle class, the middle class, we'll get a working class, but we'll start seeing people slowly rise. However, the rich and the poor, there'll be even bigger differences. And so some solutions to that will come out because of the Industrial Revolution to kind of close that. Now, these emerging middle class were skilled workers, were professionals, and so education slowly became a very important thing to continue to work your way up the social ladder. The positive effects of this, jobs for workers, okay, and provided a new idea for the wealth of a nation. Remember, now they can create more pies. It's not just one pie. They can create as many as they want. The standard of living slowly went up. People started to slowly have healthier diets, better housing as regulations happened, as worker protections came about, which we'll talk about later. And the population did increase, right? When people have money, when they have food, we'll see that growth in population. So remember, the biggest thing, we get people, urbanization, and we're going to move from the farm to the city, and the living conditions sucked. Working conditions were worse. Our environment took a big hit during this time, but it grew our world economically. We get all these new inventions. We get new ideas going throughout. And so there are some really, really good positives as well as negatives. And we'll see the reactions to both later.